The dark expanse of space was a silent witness to centuries of forgotten history, but deep within the abandoned ruins of Earth's once mighty fleet, something stirred, a signal, a pulse, faint at first, like the thudding of a heartbeat buried beneath layers of dust and time. The silence of a galaxy that had long since turned its back on humanity was shattered by the awakening of a long-dormant power. Ronan Drax stood before the ancient control console, his fingers moving over the rusted metal with an intimacy that bordered on reverence. The room smelled of oil and disuse, the air thick with the scent of oxidized steel and decaying circuitry. It was a mausoleum, a tomb for Earth's forgotten might. Yet here, in this hollowed-out relic of a fleet that had once commanded the stars, Drax felt something stir within him, a spark of hope, long extinguished. The console hummed to life, its faint glow casting an eerie green light across the dim room. The walls, lined with corroded storage units and fractured control panels, seemed to breathe with the presence of the ship's long-dead crew. As Drax's thumb hovered over the activation switch, his breath caught. Could it really be? Could humanity's wrath, that myth whispered in hushed tones across the galaxy, still be real? He pressed down. The switch clicked, its sound sharp in the quiet. And then, a flash of light. The room jolted as if the ship itself had inhaled after centuries of slumber. Drax stumbled back, heart hammering against his ribcage. The walls trembled with an energy long forgotten, and in that moment he understood. The beacon had been more than a mere legend. It had been waiting. Outside the ship, a ripple of energy shot out into the cold expanse of space, distorting the stars like a pebble tossed into a still pond. The pulse traveled far and wide, unseen by any but those who knew to listen. Galactic sensors, dormant for eons, blinked to life, sending reports of a mysterious signal that defied all logic, all expectations. Earth had been thought to be a dying ember in a forgotten corner of the universe, yet like an ancient fire reigniting, it burned once more. Drax took a step back from the console, his eyes wide, his breath shallow. This was no mere communication. The ship, no, the fleet, was waking up. Humanity's warships, long thought to be nothing more than derelict relics, were coming to life. He could almost hear them groan as they stirred from their slumber. In the stillness, Drax's mind raced. How many were still intact? How many of these ships were still fit for war? And how would he awaken them all? He had no answers, only a gnawing certainty that this was the first step in a journey that would reshape the galaxy. He turned, his boots echoing on the cold metal floor as he made his way to the nearby data terminal. "Rory," he said, his voice rough from the years of silence, "I need everything you've got on the fleet's systems, now." From the darkened corner of the room, a figure stepped forward. Rory, a technician with an expertise in ancient human technologies, nodded without a word. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto the console as he began his work. The only sounds in the room were the rapid tapping of Rory's fingers on the keyboard and the low hum of the newly activated systems coming to life. As Drax waited, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The vastness of space outside the window seemed to press against him, reminding him of the long solitude humanity had endured. They had been cast aside, written off as irrelevant by the galaxy's powers. The Galactic Council, smug in their arrogance, had relegated Earth to the status of myth. They had forgotten Earth's ability to survive, to adapt, to fight. The stench of old engines and burned-out electronics filled the room again as Rory worked. The ship, with its long-dead crew and decaying systems, was beginning to respond, if only slightly. It was as if the ship were awakening from a deep, feverish slumber, its systems groaning, stretching. The once crimson walls flickered with ancient runes, symbols long since scrubbed from galactic knowledge, now coming to life. Rory's voice broke through the silence. "There's power, barely. Enough to get the ship operational again, but it'll take time to bring everything back online." Drax nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. He had no time to wait. Every second counted. Outside, the galaxy was still oblivious to the storm that was about to break. But in his heart, Drax could already feel it, the surge of power, of humanity's wrath, pulsing through the ship's circuits. "We don't have time," Drax muttered, more to himself than to Rory. "We need to move faster." Rory hesitated for a brief moment before speaking again. "The Council will come for us. They've already dismissed us as a myth, but they'll realize soon enough that they were wrong." Drax's eyes hardened. The realization hit him with a force that almost knocked the air from his lungs. The Council had no idea. They believed the legends, the stories of Earth's devastating force, were nothing more than ancient superstition, tools of the past. But they were wrong. Humanity was not gone. Humanity was coming, and they were bringing their wrath. "You're right," Drax said, his voice steady now. "They will come, and when they do, they'll realize that the myth is real." A low hum reverberated through the room, and Drax's heart skipped a beat. The dormant warships, hidden within the depths of space, were awakening. It was no longer just a signal. It was the beginning of something far greater. Humanity's wrath had been written off as a myth, but in this moment, Drax understood. The galaxy would soon know the truth. In the distance, beyond the reach of human eyes, a fleet of ancient warships slowly emerged from the shadows, their massive hulls cutting through the void like leviathans from an ancient ocean. The sky reflected off its cold metallic surfaces, a quiet omen of the storm that was about to come. Drax's hand gripped the edge of the console, his mind racing. The ship's systems were far from fully operational, and there was so much to be done. But one thing was clear: the myth of humanity's wrath was no longer a story. It was reality. With a final glance at Rory, Drax turned and strode toward the ship's command center. The journey had begun. Ronan Drax stood at the threshold of the command center, his gaze locked on the slowly awakening fleet outside the viewport. The deep hum of the ship's engines reverberated through the walls, a sound so ancient, so primal, it seemed to echo the beating of a forgotten heart. His pulse matched the rhythm, a slow, steady crescendo that matched the stirring of Earth's might. The old warships, hidden for centuries in the dark depths of space, were stirring to life, and in that moment he felt the weight of history pressing against his chest. The room around him smelled of burning circuits and the tang of metal, the sharp scent of ozone clinging to the stale air. The screens flickered as the ancient systems slowly booted up, their groans and whirs filling the otherwise silent room. Every inch of this place had a story to tell, stories Drax was only beginning to understand. He had no illusions about the task ahead. Awakening these warships was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in bringing them back to full strength and, more importantly, convincing the galaxy that humanity's wrath was no longer a myth. Drax's hand moved instinctively to the console, fingers brushing against the cool metal surface. It felt familiar yet foreign, like holding a piece of the past, a fragment of an era long gone. As the ship's system slowly hummed back to life, his mind wandered back to Earth, the Earth he had once known, the Earth that had been reduced to a shadow of its former glory. The galaxy had turned its back on humanity, relegating them to the annals of myth and legend, their once proud civilization reduced to stories told in hushed voices. A voice broke his reverie. "Captain Drax, we're receiving strange signals from the far reaches of the fleet." Drax turned sharply to face the technician at the communication panel. His name was Silas, quiet, competent, and always reliable when the chips were down, but the unease in his voice was enough to catch Drax's attention. "Any identification on the source?" Drax asked, his tone calm but firm. The stillness in the room was thick with anticipation. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement a potential catalyst for the storm that was about to break. Silas typed furiously on the console, his brow furrowed in concentration. The lights in the room flickered, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls, as though the ship itself was holding its breath. "It's a pulse, sir, but it's not from any known vessel. It's like a beacon, too precise to be random, too erratic to be intentional." Drax's jaw tightened. "Meaning?" "Meaning someone's already listening." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Drax turned back to the viewport, staring out at the vast emptiness of space. The space was endless, yet suffocating in their cold, indifferent beauty. They were watching. The galaxy had no idea what was coming for it, and Drax wasn't sure whether that knowledge should comfort him or fill him with dread. "We need to move quickly," Drax muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The ship's internal systems were still reawakening, sluggish and uncooperative. It was frustrating, watching the ancient behemoth struggle to regain its strength. He glanced over at the crew. They were all feeling it, tension simmering beneath the surface, their quiet determination masking the fear of the unknown. "Get the weapon systems online," Drax ordered, his voice sharp now. "We need to be ready, all of us." As the crew scrambled to comply, Drax stepped away from the command center, his boots heavy on the cold, metallic floor. His mind raced. There were too many uncertainties, too many unanswered questions. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The corridor outside the command center was dimly lit, the walls lined with faded murals from a forgotten era. The faces of long-dead soldiers stared down at him, their expressions frozen in time, their gazes distant yet resolute. It was a stark reminder of Earth's former glory, a past now lost to the void. Drax turned the corner and entered the engineering bay, where the heart of the ship pulsed in the form of engines, generators, and the life force that powered this relic of war. The room was filled with the hum of machinery, the sharp scent of oil and grease hanging in the air like an old memory. The engineers worked with practiced efficiency, adjusting levers, flipping switches, and making calculations, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of ancient consoles. "How are we looking?" Drax asked, his voice cutting through the noise. Commander Ryle, a burly man with a thick beard and hands that could crush steel, turned to face him. "Slow," he admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "The power's back, but it's like waking up a corpse. The systems are too outdated, too fragmented, but we're getting there." "Do we have a timetable?" Drax pressed, his impatience barely contained. Ryle glanced at the other engineers, a silent exchange passing between them. "We'll have the first fleet ready in a few hours. But that's just the beginning. There's a lot more to bring online." Drax nodded, taking in the information. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. Turning, he strode toward the back of the bay, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't just looking for answers. He was looking for something more, something tangible, something he could hold on to in the storm to come. But just as he reached the rear of the bay, a low rumble vibrated through the ship, followed by the distant sound of a heavy clang. Something had shifted. The ship groaned in protest. The lights flickered. For a moment, everything seemed to still. Then, from the comm speaker, Silas's voice crackled, tinged with fear. "Sir, we've got an incoming transmission, unencrypted, coming from the Council." Drax's heart skipped a beat. The Council. The very same body that had written off humanity as a myth, a force of nature no longer relevant to galactic politics. And now they were watching. They were listening. The storm was coming faster than he could have anticipated. He turned sharply and hurried back to the command center. The crew had gathered around the central terminal, their faces drawn, eyes fixed on the screen. The transmission was static at first, filled with garbled noise. But then, as Drax stepped forward, a voice cut through the distortion. "Ronan Drax," the voice said, smooth and calculating. "We've been expecting you." The words struck Drax like a fist to the gut. He stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the recognition heavy on his shoulders. The war had just begun, but they knew he was coming. They were already one step ahead, and yet there was no turning back now. Drax steeled himself, the fire of humanity's wrath slowly rekindling inside him. He met the gaze of his crew. "Prepare for the worst," he said quietly. "We've just entered the galaxy's most dangerous game." The air in the command center was thick with tension, the only sound the constant hum of the ship's slowly reviving systems. Outside, the ancient warships floated in the void like predators lying in wait, their hulking forms silent in the vastness of space. Drax stood at the helm, eyes fixed on the viewport, his jaw clenched. He could feel the weight of the decision ahead, a decision that could either solidify humanity's place in the galaxy or plunge it into an all-out war. He could hear the whispers in the back of his mind, the warnings of the crew, the doubts that gnawed at him like a hunger. The galaxy had already begun to respond. The Council's transmission had made that clear. And now Drax knew the time for diplomacy was rapidly running out. "Captain," Silas called from the comm station, breaking his reverie. "We've confirmed it. A fleet is inbound. The Council's elite fleet. They're sending everything they have." Drax didn't need to ask how long they had. He could already feel it, the growing pressure of their approach. The tension in the air felt heavier, as though the fabric of space itself was about to snap under the weight of impending conflict. He turned to face the crew, their faces a mixture of grim determination and quiet fear. He had been with them long enough to know that they weren't afraid of the fight, but they understood the stakes. Earth was no longer the underdog. It was a force to be reckoned with, but a force without enough firepower was just a target. "We're not going to wait for them to make the first move," Drax said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Prepare the fleet. We strike first." The crew responded without hesitation. They had been preparing for this moment since the first signal had been detected. The ancient warships, sluggish in their awakening, now hummed with a raw energy, as though they were finally recognizing their purpose. The weapon systems were still unreliable, but Drax knew they had no choice but to make do with what they had. The fleet would need to move quickly, decisively, before the Council could bring its full force to bear. Drax's fingers moved over the controls, and the ship's systems came alive with a low metallic thrum. The screens around him flickered to life, revealing the dark expanse of space, where the enemy fleet was still a distant blip on the radar. It was a small advantage, but it was enough. The warships around them, old and weathered as they were still the most advanced ships in existence, ships that had been designed for a purpose the galaxy had long forgotten. Now, they would serve that purpose again. He turned to his second-in-command, Commander Ryle. "Ready the fighters. I want every ship primed for combat. No mistakes." Ryle's expression remained stoic as always, but Drax could see the tension in his eyes. They had fought side by side in countless skirmishes, but this was different. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was a battle to reclaim humanity's place in the galaxy. This was their first strike, and it would be a statement. The minutes stretched on like hours. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence, the air thick with the sense of something about to unfold. The crew worked with a focused intensity, their movements fluid and practiced. Even in the midst of the mounting tension, there was a sense of calm, of purpose. They weren't just preparing for war. They were preparing to reshape the galaxy itself. Silas's voice broke the quiet, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Captain, the fleet is in position. We're ready." Drax didn't hesitate. "Execute." The ship lurched as it fired into motion, engines roaring to life as it surged forward. The massive warships, each one a leviathan in its own right, followed in formation, their engines groaning. The first strike had begun. Drax's eyes narrowed as he watched the enemy fleet approach. They were still too far to engage, but Drax could already see the outlines of their ships in the distance. The Council's elite fleet, sleek, precise, and powerful. It had the firepower to crush Earth ships in a matter of moments. But Drax didn't see their might. He saw an opportunity. "Take them off guard," Drax commanded, his voice low and steady. "We hit them hard. We hit them fast." The crew responded with a practiced efficiency. The fighters launched from the hangar bays, their engines flaring as they soared into the void. The warships followed close behind, their guns charging, ready to unleash a devastating salvo. The first few moments were a blur of motion, fire, explosions, the cacophony of battle erupting as the ships collided in the cold vastness of space. Drax's hands tightened on the controls as the first volley of fire hit its mark. The enemy fleet staggered under the attack, their shields buckling under the force of Earth's firepower. It was a promising start, but the real challenge had yet to come. "Enemy reinforcements incoming," Silas called out, his voice filled with urgency. "They've called for backup." Drax's eyes flicked to the readouts. The reinforcements were already on their way, a new wave of ships that would be far more difficult to overcome. But Drax wasn't worried. He had already anticipated this. He had known the Council would not be content with a single fleet. The true fight was about to begin. He turned to Ryle. "Deploy the secondary fleet. We can't let them regroup." The command was given, and the second wave of warships surged forward, their engines igniting with a roar that shook the ship to its core. The fleet was no longer just reacting. It was fighting with a purpose. Each ship, each fighter, a piece of the greater strategy that Drax had carefully constructed in the quiet hours of the ship's revival. Every move, every strike was a calculated risk, a gamble for survival. The battlefield was chaotic, a swirling mass of ships and fire, the void of space illuminated by the explosions that lit up the darkness. The hum of weapons fire filled the air, and Drax's senses were heightened, every detail sharp in his mind. The enemy ships were no longer mere opponents. They were obstacles to be overcome, challenges to be outsmarted. "Rory, status on the weapon systems?" Drax barked, his eyes never leaving the battlefield. "Almost there," Rory's voice crackled through the comms. "But we need more time. The power cores aren't fully stable." Drax didn't have time to wait. He pushed the ship forward, cutting through the chaos with the precision of a surgeon. The warships followed, their massive guns firing in unison, devastating the enemy ranks. The first wave of enemy ships was shattered, but there was more to come. The Council's elite fleet was not so easily defeated. "Hold steady," Drax muttered to himself, his heart pounding in his chest. "We're not finished yet." The ships continued to move through the debris, cutting through the remnants of the enemy forces with brutal efficiency. But as the last of the reinforcements fell, Drax's eyes narrowed in disbelief. "They're retreating." For a moment there was silence. The battlefield stilled, the echoes of the battle reverberating in the cold emptiness. The enemy, having been pushed back further than they had anticipated, were pulling back. Drax knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. "Prepare for their counterattack," Drax ordered, his voice resolute. "The real war has only just begun." As the enemy fleet retreated into the distance, Drax couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was waiting just beyond the edge of the sky. The battle had been won, but the cost of what was to come lingered heavily in his mind. And somewhere, far beyond the battlefield, the Council was already plotting its next move. The storm was far from over. The silence that followed the retreat of the Council's fleet felt almost surreal, a deep, oppressive quiet that filled the vast expanse of space. For a brief moment, Drax allowed himself to breathe, to feel the weight of the victory pressing against his chest. The fight had been hard, the stakes high, but the first strike had been successful. The enemy had been repelled, though Drax knew it wasn't over. The Council would regroup, strategize, and come back stronger. They would not be so easily defeated. He stood before the command center's viewport, watching the remnants of the battlefield fade into the distance. The scorched debris of enemy ships floated in the blackness, their once pristine surfaces now charred and torn. The heavens in the background seemed to mock the devastation, so calm, so untouched by the violence that had just unfolded. But Drax was too focused on what lay ahead to be lulled by the stillness. He could feel the storm gathering, both in the galaxy and within himself. Behind him, the faint clatter of movement echoed through the command center as the crew began to regroup. The tension in the air was palpable. Every person in this room knew what was coming. The Council's inevitable retaliation, the dawning realization that humanity was far from finished, and a new chapter in this war was about to be written. "Drax," a voice interrupted his thoughts, soft yet urgent. It was Silas, his face drawn with concern. "We're getting a transmission." Unencrypted. Drax didn't turn. "From the Council?" Silas nodded, though his hesitation was telling. "Yes, but it's not like the last one. This one's different." A chill ran down Drax's spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the rules of the game had changed. He turned slowly, meeting Silas's gaze, the weight of his expression clear. "Put it through," Drax ordered, his voice low. The screens around him flickered to life, and the image that appeared sent a shiver through Drax's body. It was a face he hadn't seen in years, Admiral Vane. His eyes, cold and calculating, stared back at Drax with an unsettling calm. "Ronan Drax," Vane's voice was smooth, betraying no emotion. "I must admit you've made quite an impression. But make no mistake, you've just opened a door you cannot close. You've awakened the wrath of the Council." Drax's fingers clenched at his side, the intensity of the words resonating deep within him. The Council had always seen humanity as insignificant, as a species that had faded into the annals of history. But they had underestimated Earth's potential, underestimated what humanity could do when backed into a corner. "We are ready for what comes next, Vane," Drax replied, his voice steady but thick with resolve. "You've made a grave mistake in underestimating us." Vane's lips twisted into a thin, humorless smile. "We underestimated you? No, Drax. What you fail to understand is that you've awakened something far beyond your control. Something ancient." The transmission cut off, leaving the room in eerie silence once more. Drax's gaze was locked on the screen where Vane's image had just been, his mind racing to piece together the cryptic message. "Something ancient," Drax murmured to himself. What had Vane meant? What were they planning? The unease in his stomach only deepened as the reality of the situation sank in. "Captain, we're getting reports." Ryle's voice broke the silence. The commander approached, his eyes focused on the new data streaming across the screens. "The Council's fleet is reassembling, but it's not just a counterattack. They're gathering forces we've never seen before, ships we don't recognize." The room fell still as the crew digested the implications of Ryle's words. Drax felt a knot form in his stomach. The Council was mobilizing, but this was more than just a retaliation. This was something different, something more dangerous. The fleet, no longer just a show of force, was now a harbinger of something much worse. "We've been too focused on fighting them," Drax said, his voice distant. "We need to prepare for something far worse than a fleet." He turned to Silas, whose fingers were already dancing across the console, analyzing the incoming data. "What are they bringing, Silas?" The technician's face remained calm, but the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes was enough to send a chill through Drax. I don't know yet, but these ships, they're not from any known faction. Their signatures don't match anything in the galaxy's database." Drax's mind raced. Unfamiliar ships, unknown forces. This was more than a standard military engagement. The Council wasn't just sending ships to crush humanity. They were preparing for something much deeper. And whatever it was, they were keeping it hidden, even from their own forces. "We need to get to the heart of this," Drax said, his voice hardening with resolve. "It's not just the warships we're fighting now, it's whatever the Council's holding back. Get me all the intel we have on them, everything. I want to know what we're dealing with." Ryle nodded, already moving to issue orders. "We'll start the scans immediately, Captain." The transmission cut off, leaving the room in eerie silence once more. Drax's gaze was locked on the screen where Vane's image had just been, his mind racing to piece together the cryptic message. "Something ancient," Drax murmured to himself. What had Vane meant? What were they planning? The unease in his stomach only deepened as the reality of the situation sank in. "Captain, we're getting reports." Ryle's voice broke the silence. The commander approached, his eyes focused on the new data streaming across the screens. "The Council's fleet is reassembling, but it's not just a counterattack. They're gathering forces we've never seen before, ships we don't recognize." The room fell still as the crew digested the implications of Ryle's words. Drax felt a knot form in his stomach. The Council was mobilizing, but this was more than just a retaliation. This was something different, something more dangerous. The fleet, no longer just a show of force, was now a harbinger of something much worse. "We've been too focused on fighting them," Drax said, his voice distant. "We need to prepare for something far worse than a fleet." He turned to Silas, whose fingers were already dancing across the console, analyzing the incoming data. "What are they bringing, Silas?" The technician's face remained calm, but the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes was enough to send a chill through Drax. I don't know yet. But these ships, they're not from any known faction. Their signatures don't match anything in the galaxy's database." Drax's mind raced. Unfamiliar ships, unknown forces. This was more than a standard military engagement. The Council wasn't just sending ships to crush humanity. They were preparing for something much deeper. And whatever it was, they were keeping it hidden, even from their own forces. "We need to get to the heart of this," Drax said, his voice hardening with resolve. "It's not just the warships we're fighting now. It's whatever the Council's holding back. Get me all the intel we have on them. Everything. I want to know what we're dealing with." Ryle nodded, already moving to issue orders. "We'll start the scans immediately, Captain." He could feel the absence of sleep weighing on him, the exhaustion of the long days and sleepless nights. But there was no time to rest, no time to think about anything other than the mission ahead. The mystery of the Council's secret fleet gnawed at him, a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. Every piece of intelligence they had gathered only deepened the question: what was the Council hiding? A soft beep echoed through the room, a sound that sent a ripple of unease through Drax's chest. He turned, eyes narrowing as Silas's voice came through, his tone strained, more urgent than usual. "Captain, we've got a problem." Drax's pulse quickened. He stepped toward the console, the click of his boots loud in the silence. "What's happening?" Silas didn't look up from his console, his fingers moving rapidly over the keys, his eyes scanning the data that streamed across the screen. "The new fleet, those ships we couldn't identify, they're not just sitting there. They're moving, Captain. Fast. And I'm seeing traces of an unusual signal coming from one of them. It's encrypted, but it's coming from within our fleet." Drax froze, his breath catching in his throat. He had been expecting the Council to move, expecting their next move to come with the weight of their unrelenting pursuit. But this? A betrayal from within their own ranks? "What do you mean, Silas? Are you saying there's a leak in the fleet?" Drax's voice was low, tight with tension. "I don't know yet, but it's coming from a secondary comms channel, one we hadn't activated. And it's not just a random glitch, it's something deliberate. Someone is sending information." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Betrayal. It was a word that Drax had never imagined would be a part of his fight. Not here, not now. But the evidence was irrefutable. Someone on the ship was working with the enemy. "Identify the source," Drax said, his voice sharp and unyielding. "Now." Silas worked quickly, his fingers flying over the console, his brow furrowed in concentration. The seconds stretched, each one more agonizing than the last, until at last he spoke, his voice grim. "It's coming from Ryle's station." Drax's heart stopped. Ryle, his second in command, the man who had fought beside him through every battle, the man who had stood by him when all seemed lost. The betrayal stung deep, a wound that sliced through him more sharply than any enemy weapon ever could. The walls of the command center seemed to close in on him, the air thick and suffocating. His hands clenched into fists, his nails biting into the palms of his hands. "Ryle?" Drax whispered under his breath, disbelief creeping into his voice. He turned without a word and strode toward the secondary station, the urgency in his steps betraying the calmness he tried to maintain. His boots seemed too loud in the silence of the room, the sound echoing against the cold metal walls. As he reached the station, Ryle looked up, his face unreadable, his hands resting idly on the console. "Captain," Ryle said, his voice steady, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a flicker Drax had missed before. Drax stopped in front of him, his gaze never leaving Ryle's face. He didn't need to ask. He knew the truth now. He had seen enough. The betrayal was written in Ryle's posture, in the coldness of his expression. "Are you the one sending information to the Council?" Drax's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking louder would make the truth any less unbearable. Ryle's gaze wavered for a fraction of a second. Then, in the space between heartbeats, his eyes hardened, and he nodded. "I had no choice." The words hit Drax like a blow to the chest. He staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. "No choice?" "What the hell are you talking about?" Ryle stood, his chair scraping against the floor with a screech that seemed to echo through the room. "You think this is about some personal vendetta?" It's bigger than that. The Council. They have something you don't. Something you can't possibly understand. Understand? Drax spat, the fire of betrayal rising in his chest. You've been feeding them our plans, Ryle, our strategies, our weaknesses. You've been working with them behind our backs. Ryle's eyes flickered, but his voice remained steady. The Council promised me something. Power. Protection. They promised me a future, one where I'm not stuck in the shadows of a dying race. Drax's mind reeled as the words sank in. Ryle had been seduced by the promise of something greater, something that would secure his place in the galaxy. But at what cost? The price had been humanity itself. Ryle? Drax's voice trembled with the weight of disbelief. You betrayed us for a future that doesn't even exist. A future built on the bones of your own people. Ryle took a step back, his hands raised in a defensive gesture. I didn't have a choice. I did what I had to do to survive. Drax felt his stomach churn, a sick feeling rising in his chest. This wasn't survival. This was treason. This was everything humanity had fought against. The very essence of what they stood for had been corrupted by the promise of power. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. You're done, Ryle. You'll face the consequences for your actions. Before Ryle could respond, the ship shook violently, throwing both men off balance. The sudden jolt sent Drax's heart racing, adrenaline flooding his veins. The ship's alarms blared, and the crew scrambled to their stations, but Drax's eyes never left Ryle's. This isn't over, Drax growled. We'll deal with this later. Ryle's lips twitched, his hands dropping to his side. I never wanted it to come to this. Drax didn't wait for him to finish. He turned sharply and stormed back to the command center, the full scope of the betrayal settling heavily in his chest. The battle was far from over, and now the stakes had changed. They had a traitor in their midst, and Drax would make sure that this new enemy wouldn't escape. The ship rocked again, a violent tremor that seemed to shake the very foundations of the warship. This was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter of suspicion, uncertainty, and the weight of betrayal. As Drax watched the chaos unfold around him, he knew one thing for certain. The galaxy had underestimated humanity. But now, humanity was fighting its own battles, not just against the Council, but against the traitors among them. The war had only just begun. The ship shuddered beneath Drax's feet, another violent tremor that reverberated through the walls. Alarms blared, a sharp, relentless screech that rattled his nerves. The control center was alive with frenzied activity, crew members scrambling to their stations, voices rising in an urgent cacophony. Drax stood at the heart of the chaos, his mind sharp, focused. The betrayal had hit hard, but it was nothing compared to what lay ahead. The traitor was dealt with for now, but the battle was far from over. The ship rocked again, this time more violently. The hull groaned under the pressure, and for a brief moment the dim lights flickered. Drax gripped the edge of the command console, his knuckles turning white. The feeling of the ship's struggle beneath him, the tension in the air, only served to amplify the weight of the moment. The Council had sent reinforcements. He knew that much. But now, as the battle raged on outside, something was different. The energy in the room shifted, a palpable sense of dread that no one could ignore. "Captain!" Silas's voice cracked through the rising tension, sharp with anxiety. "We've detected something. A new fleet. But it's not like anything we've seen before." Drax's gaze snapped to the screen in front of him, eyes narrowing as the new fleet materialized on the radar. The ships were massive, imposing, their designs unlike anything in the galaxy. Their signatures were erratic, inconsistent, and yet undeniably powerful. Drax could feel the weight of this new threat pressing on him, like the steady advance of a storm on the horizon. "They're coming," Drax muttered under his breath. "Get us into position now." The crew moved quickly, their focus sharpened by the urgency in Drax's voice. The ship's thrusters fired to life, the metal groaning in protest as they began their maneuver. But the new fleet was already closing in, moving faster than expected. Drax's mind raced, calculating the best course of action, weighing his options, but it was clear. This wasn't just a fleet of reinforcements. This was something more, something dangerous. The air in the command center felt thick, heavy, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. The walls seemed to hum with the energy of the approaching battle, the faint smell of oil and old technology mingling with the sharp tang of sweat from the crew. Drax could almost taste the tension in the air, the smell of ozone, the taste of metal, the faint whisper of the ship's ancient systems straining against the pressure. It was all too familiar. It felt like the calm before the storm. "Rory," Drax said, his voice steady despite the growing sense of urgency. "What's the status on the weapon systems?" Rory, who had been working frantically on the terminal, looked up, his face drawn and weary. "We're almost there, Captain. But the power cores are still unstable. We can't push them too hard or they'll overload. I need more time." "Time is something we don't have," Drax snapped, but his tone softened as he saw the exhaustion on Rory's face. They were all running on empty, but they couldn't stop now. "Get it done. Now." The tension crackled in the air as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The command center was a whirlwind of motion, the crew moving with practiced efficiency. But beneath it all, there was a sense of dread that no one could shake. The unknown fleet, closing in with terrifying speed, felt like the prelude to something much worse. Then, suddenly, a series of explosions rocked the ship. The lights flickered again, and a sharp metallic screech echoed through the hull. The crew gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to freeze the moment. Drax's eyes narrowed, his heart pounding in his chest. "Report!" he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We've taken hits to the outer shields," Silas called out, his voice tight with fear. "They're stronger than we anticipated. Shields are down to 50%. Drax's mind raced as he calculated their next move. The new fleet was more advanced, more powerful, and they had already demonstrated their ability to break through their defenses. They couldn't afford to let it go any further. "Prepare the secondary weapons," Drax ordered, his voice low but firm. "Fire at will." The command was met with swift execution. The ship's weapon systems, though imperfect, roared to life. The first blast hit one of the incoming ships, a powerful salvo that ripped through its hull. But the enemy fleet didn't flinch. The impact barely slowed them down. They were advancing with relentless precision, unyielding in their pursuit. Drax's fist clenched at his side. "We need to pull back," he said, his voice taut with frustration. "We can't fight them head-on." "Captain, we've got a better chance if we hold our ground," Ryle said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We've still got the advantage. If we keep them here, we can break through their defenses." Drax turned to Ryle, his gaze hard. The man had been through every battle with him, but this was different. There was a new urgency in his voice, a certainty that Drax couldn't ignore. He didn't have time to question it. They had no choice but to trust each other, even in the face of this overwhelming threat. "All right," Drax said, his jaw tight. "We fight. We hold our ground." The ship jolted again, the sound of impacts reverberating through the hull. The atmosphere in the command center grew even more tense, the sense of impending doom hanging over them like a dark cloud. But Drax was resolute. The fate of humanity rested on their ability to survive this. They had no room for doubt. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. The new fleet closed in, their weapons firing with deadly precision. The ship shook under the barrage, the sound of exploding debris filling the air. Drax gritted his teeth, his focus never wavering. They couldn't let this fight slip away. They couldn't afford to lose. And then, as the enemy fleet came within range, something unexpected happened. A sudden surge of energy coursed through the ship. The power cores flared to life, brighter than they had ever been before. The weapon systems, previously unstable, now hummed with a newfound intensity. "Captain!" Rory's voice cut through the chaos. "The systems! They're stable. We can hit them with everything we've got." Drax's eyes lit up with a surge of hope, his instincts kicking into overdrive. "Fire everything. Don't hold back." The ship's cannons roared to life, unleashing a torrent of firepower that shook the very fabric of space. The first volley hit the enemy ships with devastating force, tearing through their shields like paper. But the new fleet wasn't finished. They retaliated with an overwhelming barrage, their weapons hitting the ship with brutal force. The fight was escalating, the battle now a brutal dance of destruction. Drax could feel the heat of the weapons' fire on his skin, the tremors of each explosion rattling his bones. His focus was unyielding, his mind calculating their every move, knowing that their survival depended on every decision, every shot. But even as they fought, Drax couldn't shake the feeling that something else was lurking in the shadows, something even more dangerous than the enemy they could see. The Council's secret fleet was just the beginning. What they were facing now was only a prelude to something far worse, and Drax knew that whatever was coming, they had to be ready. The air in the command center was thick with the acrid scent of burning circuits and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. The ship groaned under the pressure, every tremor reverberating through the hull like the tremors of a dying beast struggling to hold its ground. The battle outside raged on, an orchestra of destruction that seemed to echo in every corner of the ship. Drax stood at the center of it all, the weight of leadership pressing heavily on his shoulders. His eyes were fixed on the screens in front of him, watching as their enemy's firepower tore through their defenses, sending shockwaves through the ship's structure. "Report!" Drax demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with a sharpness that cut through the tension in the room. He didn't need to ask twice. Every member of the crew had already been working tirelessly, their faces drawn and tired, but their focus unbroken. "We're holding steady, Captain," Silas said, his voice strained but resolute. "But our shields are down to 30%, and we're taking heavy damage on the port side. The secondary weapons are firing, but they're not enough to hold them off." Drax clenched his jaw. It wasn't enough. It wasn't even close. The Council's fleet had come at them with overwhelming force, but there was a deeper, more insidious strategy unfolding before his eyes. These weren't just ships. They were distractions. And the real threat? The unknown fleet that had been lurking just out of their reach, moving in the shadows. He could feel it closing in on them, tightening like a noose. "Commander Ryle," Drax called, his voice sharp as he turned to his second-in-command. "We need to adapt. Fast. Our weapons are falling short, and they know it. What's the status on the alternate strategies?" Ryle, ever the calm under pressure, met his gaze with a quiet nod. "We've got a few options, but they all depend on timing. The enemy's unpredictable, and if we react too slowly, we'll be outmaneuvered. We need to push them back without exposing ourselves. It's going to be a delicate balance." Drax's mind raced as he considered the options. There was no room for error. They couldn't keep fighting blindly. They needed to turn the tide. The decision he made now could mean the difference between life and death, not just for his crew, but for the future of humanity. "We don't have the luxury of time," Drax said, his eyes narrowing as the data streamed across the screen. "Prepare a diversion. We'll create a window of opportunity. We can't afford to be predictable. We'll send them into the storm." The crew moved into action immediately, each person aware of the risk but willing to follow Drax's lead. They had all been trained for moments like this, but no one truly knew how they would fare until they were in the thick of it. The hum of the engines vibrated underfoot, and the ship's lights flickered again, casting the command center in a dim, flickering glow. The ship seemed to respond to their collective will, a powerful force pushing forward, yet still fragile, ready to break under the strain. Drax's mind was focused entirely on the task ahead. His plan wasn't perfect. It couldn't be. But it was the only option. They would need to break through the enemy's formation and create chaos. With their primary weapons exhausted, it was time to outsmart them, to turn their own momentum against them. A plan based on misdirection, on confusing their enemy and disrupting their formation. "Deploy the secondary fleet," Drax ordered. "Give them a few seconds to think they have us cornered. Then we hit them with everything we have." Ryle's eyes flickered, a silent understanding passing between them. Ryle knew this was the point of no return. There would be no turning back after this move. The crew began to move, the rapid clicking of buttons and the hum of machinery all blending into the tension that gripped the room. They would send out the decoys first, distracting the enemy, pulling their focus away from the core of their fleet. Meanwhile, the rest of the warships would circle around, positioning themselves for a surprise strike. The strategy was risky. They would be exposed. but they had no other choice. Outside, the enemy's ships were drawing closer, their sleek forms cutting through the darkness like predatory beasts. Drax could almost feel the weight of their presence, the cold calculation behind each movement. The enemy was fast, efficient, but they were also predictable. Drax knew the patterns they had used before. The trick would be to turn their tactics on themselves. "Now," Drax said, his voice low and controlled. The first wave of decoys launched, small, fast ships that darted into the path of the enemy, giving the illusion of a desperate retreat. The enemy fleet, eager to capitalize on the advantage, moved in with lethal precision. It was a perfect distraction, just as Drax had planned. "Now's our moment," Drax muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The real fleet surged forward, breaking through the decoys with a swift and brutal strike. The enemy had been lured into their trap. The decoys had done their job, drawing the enemy's fire, forcing them to concentrate their efforts on false targets. Now the real attack hit them like a hammer blow. Drax could feel the power of their own guns roaring to life as they released a barrage of fire that shook the enemy fleet to its core. The space around them seemed to explode in flashes of light and fire as their weapons tore through the enemy ships, cutting them down one by one. But it wasn't enough to win the battle yet. Drax knew they had to press the attack, to keep the momentum on their side. The enemy fleet was powerful, yes, but they were still vulnerable. The confusion they had sown in their ranks had created a window of opportunity, a brief moment where they could strike decisively and break the Council's hold. The secondary fleet, now in position, moved in swiftly, launching another series of attacks, forcing the enemy to scatter in disarray. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a critical turning point. Drax could see it in the way the enemy's formation began to crack, the once unified fleet splintering under the pressure. But even as the enemy faltered, Drax knew this wasn't over. The real battle was still ahead, and the Council wouldn't give up so easily. The true test of their strategy was yet to come. He had a fleeting sense of victory, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just one step on a long road. They had pushed the enemy back, for now, but it was far from certain that this would be enough. "Report!" Drax barked, his focus never wavering. The crew responded with urgency, eyes glued to their stations. The readouts flashed across the screens, each one a testament to the calculated chaos they had unleashed. "We've crippled their formation," Silas confirmed, his voice filled with a hint of relief. "But they're regrouping. The main fleet is preparing for another strike." Drax's eyes narrowed. They were far from done. The enemy might be reeling, but they were not finished. He had to plan the next move, swift, decisive, and overwhelming. The battle had shifted, but the war was far from over. "We'll finish this," Drax said, his voice steady. "Prepare for the next wave. We hit them again, harder this time, and when they break, we'll push through to the heart of their fleet. We've got them on the ropes. It's time to end this." The final push was coming, but Drax could feel the weight of it, the growing certainty that whatever came next would change everything. The Council would never expect what was coming for them, and humanity, once thought to be a myth, would now be the one to rewrite. The command center pulsed with energy, the hum of machinery reverberating through the walls like the heartbeat of the ship itself. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burned circuits, the metallic taste of ozone lingering in Drax's mouth as he stared out the viewport. They outside seemed distant, almost indifferent to the chaos unfolding just beyond them. For a brief moment, there was a strange calm, an unsettling stillness as the remnants of the Council's forces regrouped, their once unified might now splintered, fractured under the relentless push of humanity's fury. Drax's eyes narrowed as he watched the flickering readouts on the control panels. They had struck hard, and the enemy was reeling, but the battle was far from won. The Council's elite fleet had been shattered, their ships scattered, but the true test had only just begun. The betrayal that had threatened to tear them apart was still fresh in his mind, but now it felt like a distant echo. Humanity had survived, and in doing so, had carved its place in the galaxy. But even as victory seemed within their grasp, Drax knew the final strike was yet to come. The enemy was regrouping, yes, but they had no idea what was waiting for them. "Captain!" Ryle's voice broke through the tension in the room. His tone was calm, measured, but there was a sharp edge to it. The fleet's broken. We've got them right where we want them. It's time. Drax turned slowly, his gaze meeting Ryle's, the weight of the moment settling between them. There was no more room for doubt, no more room for hesitation. They had come this far, fought through betrayal, uncertainty, and the overwhelming odds stacked against them. But this wasn't just about survival. It was about the galaxy finally understanding one simple truth. Humanity wasn't a myth. Humanity was a force to be reckoned with. "We hit them with everything we've got," Drax said, his voice steady, every word carrying the full weight of their struggle. "No holding back. We're not just defending Earth anymore. We're redefining the future." The crew moved quickly, the air thick with urgency as they prepared for the final assault. The ship shook again as they moved into position, the engines roaring to life with a thunderous fury that vibrated through the hull. The weapon systems were fully powered, the shields back up, stronger than before. This was it, the moment they had been fighting for. "Captain," Silas called, his voice tight with anticipation. "The enemy fleet is closing in, but they're disorganized. They've underestimated us. Again." Drax's lips curled into a grim smile. "They've always underestimated us." The final wave of fire came from their own fleet, a concentrated burst of power that lit up the darkness of space like a star imploding in slow motion. The enemy fleet staggered, caught off guard by the ferocity of the attack. The ships, sleek and formidable as they were now vulnerable, battered and bruised, their once mighty shields flickering under the relentless assault. The impact was immediate. The first enemy ship disintegrated in an explosion of light and debris, the shockwave radiating outward, knocking the surrounding vessels off course. Drax felt a surge of exhilaration as the barrage tore through the ranks, his heart pounding in time with the firing of their cannons. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. "Keep the pressure on them," Drax barked. "Push them back, force them into a corner." The ship groaned as it responded to his command, the weapons locking onto their targets with deadly accuracy. The battle was intense. Each strike, each blast of fire, a testament to the resilience that Drax had come to expect from his crew. Every move, every shot, calculated and precise. They weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to show the galaxy what Earth was capable of. But even as the enemy fleet began to crumble under the weight of humanity's onslaught, Drax knew the most important battle was yet to come. The Council's final strike, their last card to play, was looming just on the horizon. And he could feel it, the tension in the air, the stillness before the storm. "Prepare for the final push," Drax said, his voice calm but filled with an unshakable certainty. "This is where we make our stand. We end this here, once and for all." As the last of the enemy ships were disabled, Drax's gaze turned inward, his thoughts turning to Earth itself. The legacy of humanity had always been one of defiance, of survival against all odds. The galaxy had written them off. They had called them a myth. And now, here they were, facing down the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. And they were winning. But there was no room for pride, no room for celebration. They had come too far, fought too hard to let this slip through their fingers. The enemy fleet, battered and broken, was retreating, but Drax knew this wasn't over. The final battle was not just against the forces of the Council. It was against the very perception the galaxy held of humanity. It was against their dismissal, their belief that Earth was a fading star. And then, just as Drax's thoughts were about to turn to the next phase of their fight, a voice came through, crackling over the comms. "Drax," Vane's voice was cold, calculated. "You've made your move. But understand this. You may have won the battle, but the war is far from over." Drax's eyes narrowed. "The war isn't over because humanity says it's over," he said, his voice unwavering. "The galaxy will learn what happens when you push us too far." Vane laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed through the comms. "We'll see, won't we?" The transmission cut off. And as the silence enveloped the command center once more, Drax turned his attention back to the fleet. The war was not over, but humanity had proven its strength, its resolve. The myth was no longer a myth. They were real. Earth was real. The final moments of the battle came like the culmination of a long, drawn-out struggle. Each explosion, each burst of fire, a reminder of the price they had paid. But humanity had won. They had not just survived, they had thrived. Drax stood at the helm, his face set in grim determination. The galaxy now knew that humanity was not a force to be trifled with. They had fought against impossible odds, and they had emerged victorious. The stars outside the viewport, once distant and indifferent, now seemed to shine brighter. They were no longer a forgotten people. They were Earth's children, and they had returned to claim their place among the stars. And as Drax looked out into the vast, star-filled void, a quiet realization settled in his chest. The galaxy would never be the same. Humanity had proven it. The myth of Earth's wrath was no longer a whisper. It was a thunderclap heard across the universe. The story of humanity's rise had just begun.